was early February, and the monsoon winds that were sweeping up the east coast of Africa were driving huge swells, giant waves, into the area where we were operating in the North Arabian Sea. I was a young lieutenant, strapped into an ejection seat in a Navy jet, trying to provide moral support to my pilot, who was desperately struggling to get us safely back aboard USS Enterprise. Outside, the conditions were terrible. It was pitch dark, middle of the night, and our windscreen was covered with salt spray that had dried on during the low altitude mission that we were just wrapping up. Inside, the conditions were no better. My pilot, who went by the call sign of Westmo, was exhausted from flying at low altitudes for 4 hours in the dark. And as if that wasn't enough, he had a case of vertigo. Now, what's vertigo? Vertigo is something that aviators call the leans. And it's a disagreement between what your eyes are seeing and what your inner ear is experiencing. So in this case, Westmo's eyes are focused on the artificial horizon. And it's telling him, wings are level, you're doing okay, just keep it coming, and things will probably work out all right. His inner ear, however, which has never evolved for the forces of high performance flight, is screaming at him that the airplane is right wing down, and if he doesn't roll to the left, we're going to cartwheel into the water and die. Now, it's pretty much a full-time job for Westmo to just referee that fight right now, and there's really nothing that I can do to help him, so I'm focused on my full-time job in the moment, and that's to find the ship. So I'm peering through that salt-encrusted windscreen, and I'm thrilled when I see a glimpse of a speck of light in the gloom ahead. The good news is it's the ship. The bad news is it's a ship. And like every floating object, it's subject to the forces of wind and wave. Now remember those giant swells that I mentioned earlier? Well, the ship is riding those, okay? And I see a couple of nods out there. The bow is plunging through the troughs of those giant swells. The ship is rolling like a canoe. You wouldn't think it could, but it does. And the entire ship is yawing as it rides those swells. And to make matters worse, it's got one final axis of motion that it's moving on. It's actually doing a motion called heave, where it heaves straight up and then straight back down again with a vertical motion of about 20 feet on an irregular cycle of every 10 to 30 seconds. So the deck is moving. Now, we have no other option. We have to get back aboard the ship. Well, I suppose there would be one other option. We could eject or ditch the airplane, but that's going to put us in the North Arabian Sea. And if you know anything about the Indian Ocean, you know that the Indian Ocean, in addition to the wild weather, includes a well-developed food chain. At the bottom of that food chain are unpleasant things like stinging jellyfish. At the top of that food chain, unquestioned, cruises the great white shark. And we'd end up somewhere in the middle, paddling around like the family golden doodle, right? So that's not something we want to do. That's not an option. We have to get back aboard the ship. So as we approach, we check in with the LSO, the landing signal officer. That's the guy who's stationed on the port side of the ship near the stern. And his job is to help aircrew like us get airplanes like ours safely back aboard the ship. So when we check in with him, he's got some news for us. The first is the deck is moving. It's like, yes, we expected that. The second is the deck is moving so much, in fact, that the optical landing system, the system that is made of lights and mirrors and projects a beam of light behind the ship that we follow down to the deck, is inoperable. And he has some practical advice for us. Please disregard. It's like, oh, that's great. But he has some words of encouragement. You sound good. Keep it coming. It's like, okay, great. So this is basically up to the two of us, my pilot with the leans and me, and two scared sets of eyeballs to get this airplane back aboard the ship. So before we begin that first approach, this would probably be a good time to do a little primer on how you land aboard a ship at sea. So you approach the carrier from behind as it steams away from you. It's moving at about 15 miles an hour to keep wind down the deck. That makes it a little easier to land. There are 4 arresting gear. They're called that because they arrest you from flight. They arrest your forward movement. They consist of steel-wrapped hemp cables about that big around strapped across the back of the ship. They're numbered from the stern, 1, 2, 3, and 4. A perfect landing is one where the pilot doesn't drift high and doesn't go dangerously low. It's graded as an OK. It's really understated, but it's the dream of every Navy pilot. You also want to end on the third wire. So an OK 3 pass, that's like an A+ stars, happy smile, the whole thing. So that's what you want to do. Tonight, to be honest, I'm not thinking about an OK 3 pass. A successful landing is one that does not end in a fireball or with salt water in the cockpit. That's the new standard for success. So we begin our first approach, and as we get in close, the bow of the ship plunges into one of those troughs, and it actually changes the geometry of the flight deck so that the arresting gear are moved down, and we land beyond all 4 arresting gear. So we hit the deck. No Navy pilot ever touches down. They hit the deck. You set up a ready descent and fly into the deck. We hit the deck, the pilot automatically slams the throttles forward, as all Navy pilots are trained to do. We do what's called a bolter, a missed landing. We go around for 5 more minutes of flying in the dark. We come around for our second pass, and as we get low, getting close, the LSO keys his radio and says, "Wave it off, the deck is coming up." So what was going on was the deck was heaving in this case, coming up with such power that it could blow our tires, smash our landing gear, or worse. Another bolter, 5 more minutes of flying in the dark. On our third pass, my pilot drifts a little high. He corrects, so we land a little long and really hard. And the hook literally skips over the last wire, over the 4 wire. A hook skip. What else can happen? Well, first of all, you never ask that question. But we get a hook skip, another bolter, 5 more minutes of flying in the dark. So we come around for our 4th pass, and I look over at Westmo, and he's at the end of his rope. He's hunched over the controls. His eyes are glued to the dash. He's sweating. He's muttering under his breath. And through clenched teeth, he says to me, "Just tell me when I'm over the deck." So, okay, I can do that. So I'm on my side of the cockpit, and I've got one eye on the radar altimeter to make sure we don't fly into the back of the ship or the ocean, which are equally unsatisfactory outcomes. And I've got another eye looking just outside the airplane, straight down, knowing if I don't see anything, we're still over the water. If we come over an object, that's what I'm going to notice down there. As long as it's pitch black, we're still over water. So I start calling out to Westmo, "Water, water, water, steel." And when I shout "steel" at him, he pulls the throttles back and makes a play for the deck. Now there's a moment in every night landing at sea where you're not sure whether you landed or died. There's a huge crash. There's deceleration that you have to experience to appreciate. The airplane actually plays out over the end of the deck, so you're staring into the abyss. And then you're gently pulled back. A crewman steps up with 2 flashlight wands and directs you to safe parking on the starboard side of the ship. We were home.